Coaching him?
Yeah.
You okay?
Yeah, I'm good. Yep.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and people from Scotland. So, welcome anyway to the VolksWorld Show, and it's hard to think that it's back in 1987 that we started the magazine, so it's a hell of a long time. Today we are very pleased to welcome three luminaries from the Porsche world, the VW world, from the US of A. I'll introduce them to you one by one and then say a few special words to somebody. On my far right, I have Dean Kirsten from VWmagazine. Who, back in the day was well known for having a blue 67 sedan on DDS 5-hand wheels. A car which has never had the exposure that it really deserves, and we hope that one day somebody will put together a recreation of it. In the middle is my father, Mr. Ronald Jefferson Fleming. Who some of you may know as being a fellow beer drinker at European Buggin and famous places like that. He's star of, well, I don't know really. Star of stage and screen.
Screen.
And upside down racing. And I'm absolutely delighted to introduce to you Mr. Dave Andrews, who was Darrell Vittone's partner in the race shop and an incredibly accomplished and successful drag racer, and whose car, or recreation of his car, is downstairs in the foyer, the Blue 67. This is Dave's first trip outside the US of A, so we are really truly privileged to have him here today. We had to drag him kicking and screaming, but he made it in the end.
Yeah, it was an effort.
Yeah. But no, we're really pleased to welcome him. Before we kick off, as you know, or many of you will know, Ron had a slight mishap in my race car last year. His race car at Mike Hunsaker's at Sacramento, and although initially, obviously, thought that everything was fine, first thing he did was ask for a beer. But then obviously it became clear that it wasn't quite straightforward as that, and we were all desperately worried about Ron's health, and delighted to say that after a lengthy period of recuperation, he's now chasing girls around just the same as ever and downing beers just the same as ever. Right, the idea of today's, it's been said a seminar, but it's a bunch of old guys just talking. It's about to talk about EMPI and raceshop and BRM wheels, and anything that you guys would like to bring up. If there is anything you'd like to ask, raise your hand and we will ignore and we will come and ask you. No, we'll try to avoid it. If it's a difficult question, we'll avoid it. And if it isn't, then wait for it, because you'll get the answers to all the questions you've been wanting to ask for years. But I'd like to kick off by asking Dino, first of all, because him having restored Darrell's 67 race car, white car down in the foyer, Dean can just give us a little background on where EMPI will have originated from, and obviously the name is still excellent today, but the original EMPI has a long history, and Dean has been doing a lot of research into this at the moment. So I'd like Dino to just briefly go through the history of EMPI up until the end of the golden era, shall we say.
Get the mic away from him.
Hi everybody, hope you're having a good time today. when I was looking for Darrell's 67, I had to do a lot of research to try to track it down because it had been lost in time. And in doing so, I got more interested in the origins of EMPI and Economotors and the Vittone family. And so once I found the car and restored the car, I continued to do research on the origins of all of this. And I became fascinated on the accomplishments of Joe Vittone and his son Darrell. And the more I got into it, the more I realized that there was a lot of history of the Volkswagen performance industry started right there. So, so I think briefly I'd like to start from the beginning if I can. And we'll, like I said, as we go along, you guys come up with a question and you would like to hear more about a certain area, by all means, let us know. So Joe Vittone, obviously with Italian origins, he was born in Italy, and his family migrated into California in the 40s, and Darrell was born in 1944. It was the only child that Catherine and Joe had. Joe went into the Air Force for a brief period of time. And during this time period, they were living in Stockton, which is just south of San Francisco. And when Joe left the Air Force, he got into motorcycles and he started a motorcycle business in the city of Stockton. And that's where he first had interacted with the Volkswagen. So now we're talking early 50s, so the Volkswagen just started coming over. And during that period of time, Volkswagen was romancing these these motorcycle dealers about the potential of starting a franchise on the Volkswagen car, figuring they're both intercooled. And so a strange thing happened along the way. In about 1954, Joe was riding a motorcycle in the city of Stockton and got run over by a bus. And he was severely injured. His right leg was almost destroyed. And so you'll see a lot of pictures of Joe in crutches and limping or cane. He had a thicker heel on one side. Well, he ended up suing the city of Stockton because of the accident. And there was a financial settlement, and I couldn't tell you the amount, but it was substantial. That was the seed money that he used to buy the franchise, Volkswagen franchise. And they gave him a selection of cities in Southern California, and he picked Riverside. And I think one of the things that he mentioned in some of his interviews with Keith and other people is the fact that there was a racetrack there, and he liked the population. So he moved the family in 1954 to Riverside and opened Economotors in 1955. And from what I understand, then, in order to get a franchise, and I don't know the dollar amount, you had to buy 2 cars from Volkswagens and a pile of parts, and then you were in business. And they found an old Hudson dealer that was going out of business on 5th and Main in downtown Riverside, and he ended up leasing that building, and that became the first Economotors, and that opened in 1955. And he had a partner, Holt Hoy, and he was his financial partner. So the two of them financially were able to start this dealership going. And at that time, there was so little known about the maintenance of these Volkswagens. They were really on a learning curve. And some of the early employees included Dean and Ken Lowry, and I'm sure you've heard that name. And they were some of the line mechanics that started there. And one of the things that the Volkswagen showed signs of is the valve job. About 20,000 miles on a 36 horsepower engine, cars were starting to come in with problems. Well, Volkswagen said you can replace the valves, you can replace the springs, but if the heads need valve guides, they were junk. You had to replace them. So over a period of time, they started seeing stacks of heads in the corner, and they said, this was such a waste. Why can't we replace these valve guides? So they started looking into it, and Joe's financial partner said, my brother works for the Packard factory where they build the Merlin airplane engines. And so he said, let's ask him what material, what we could do. And Holt's brother said, you need to use aluminum silicon bronze. That's the superior material. So then they had to find someone to make these valve guides. So there was a local airport in Riverside called Flaybot. And one of the owners had a machine shop and repaired airplane engines. And so they asked him, he said, well, yeah, I can make these, I have a screw machine. So they started making a few valve guides, they put them in heads, and like I said, this is against what Volkswagen would ever tell a dealer to do. And they work great. They've saved these heads, saved the customer money, and those valve guides was the beginning of EMPI. And so he knew he had to start another company distancing from Volkswagen. So over on Roberta Street, a couple of miles down the street, he bought a property and put up a brick building, and that became EMPI. But it also became the body and paint shop for the dealership because it was such a small building, they couldn't do body and fender. And Joe said, well, we need to offer this service. So the original EMPI building was a body and fender shop, and that's where not manufacturing, but let's say storage of the inventory of these early EMPI parts. And that was 1956. So they had two of these businesses. That's the origins of these two monsters of businesses. And from there, they grew at quite an incredible rate. In 1967, Hot Rod Magazine announced that Economotors was the largest Volkswagen dealership in the United States. And that, to me, is pretty fantastic to hear that Joe Vittone, in that short period of time, had that kind of success. So, so that's the beginning of the two. So I'm going to stop there. Anyone have any other questions at this point before we continue? Okay.
Yeah, how did they get the name?
Which one?
EMPI.
Engineered motor products.
Yeah, the original name was Engineered Motor Products.
Incorporated.
And obviously it changed to Europe. It changed a few years later on, but he just came up with it. And the logo, as a lot of you people know, he liked the Pan Am Airlines logo. He kind of adopted that, and that's kind of used that, and so that's how it started. I'm trying to think what this. As they started growing on these accessories, they started importing parts. They started seeing that there was parts being made in Europe, and some of these tuning parts from Acrossa and Denzel, they were readily available, but somebody had to figure this stuff out. The jetting on it, putting these parts together, and that's where Dean Lowry came into the picture. Dean originally worked at the dealership for a year, but left because I think he got tired of working on cars on the rack. And then when EMPI started growing, Joe says, I need to get this guy back. So he went, found Dean, and offered him a new job. He says, this time, I don't want you to work on customers' cars at Economotors. I want you to work for EMPI, and I want you to head up an R&D department. I want you to work on developing these parts and sorting them out. And of course, Dean said, sure, that's what I want to do. This is a great opportunity. And that's how Dean Lowry came into the picture, into EMPI, and headed up a new department, which was EMPI R&D.
You want to say something before I do this?
Just before.
I'll be right with you.
Just make sure he doesn't get that back again. Okay. But one major part of the EMPI story, which a lot of people over in this side of the pond are not quite so aware of, is the link between EMPI and the UK through obviously Speedway. It was in 1962 that Joe and Darrell flew over to the UK because they'd been
dealing with company Speedwell over here, doing the Speedwell developed the camper compensator deal, which was basically a trade-off from the Porsches having the camper compensator on 356s. And so a joint deal was set up where Speedwell would sell some EMPI parts over here, but primarily it was a deal where Speedwell parts would go across to the States. The most famous result of this link obviously ended up being the Speedwell BRM wheel, which we'll come to in a minute. But had it not been for Speedwell coming in with some new ideas, helping the market grow in the States with new products, and vice versa, EMPI coming over here, the VW scene in Europe would probably not be what it is today, because Speedwell started out doing tuning on British cars, Austin A35s and the like, and their mechanic, when they started, was a young guy called Graham Hill, who was racing and then got a contract with Lotus, and Colin Chapman, the boss of Lotus, didn't like the idea of him messing around with these other products, etc., and tried to discourage him from it. But Graham Hill did his own thing, became a director of Speedwell. But Speedwell had a major influence or major effect on what happened with EMPI in Europe, with the same with the BRM wheel. And I think that between Dean and Ron have quite a lot to say about that particular subject. Before I hand the microphone back to my dad, I'd like to say to Dave, what are your recollections at the time of the everything, and how did that segue into the race shop deal?
Dave Andrews.
Okay.
I didn't show up in California until about the middle of '68. So I came from back east. I'm from Pennsylvania originally, and I drove a bug all the way across country to Riverside. And I was driving up the street one day, and in a window, I saw the engine, and I couldn't believe it. I mean, that's the car. Got out of my car, looked in the window, yep, that was it. And Darrell was in there working, and he came and opened the door, and said, you want to come in? Yeah, I'm going to come in. And at that time, I was in the Air Force. So I was in the Air Force from '68 to '72. So he basically said, you want to give me a hand around here? He kind of liked me. And I said yes. So in my spare time, I was always hanging around the shop down there. And we got to be pretty good friends. And what do I want to say? Things just kind of evolved from that point. But I already had EMPI parts. I have the EMPI catalog down in Pennsylvania. I think the first thing I bought was the camera compensator. And exhaust was the second thing. But when I came to California, I hit the mother lode. I mean, it was like the gold rush. And when I stumbled across, you can't forget. And it was a very good experience. And
So when did you and Darrell make the decision to start the business?
Things evolved. We were in a couple different shops. And then, you mean going to Economotors?
Well,
Race shop.
with the race shop, when did that start?
That started, back when we were at the second shop. And then when EMPI ended up getting sold to the Eliminator, we kind of designated the race shop. And that was our thing. So we started doing our own thing. And we were back in a big Quonset hut behind Economotors at the time. And we basically kind of did our own thing. You know, we were in racing and development and things like that. So
So Dave, when you came from Pennsylvania across to California, was that the Blue 67 that you came across and then turned into
The race car.
yeah, it was streetcar. Drove it across country. Had another friend of mine who was in the Army at the time, and I dropped him off in Oklahoma. And he was a big, I can't believe we could get everything in the car. He was a 6'2" guy. So we had a 6'2", me, luggage, because I'm going to Parliament somewhere, and no air conditioning. You know, those were the days where you just went, and that's kind of.
So Ron, what are your recollections of that time?
Oh, back in that time?
Yeah.
Oh, that was, if you want to, we, the Panzers, made our trip up to EMPI, and we met Dean, and of course we met Darrell, and Darrell was a young guy, and he was part-time, I forget what service he was National Guard, yeah, there you go. But just for a second, I'd like to break and first of all thank Phil and the magazine for this opportunity to hang out with my bigger family, VW nuts. I love all of you. VW people everywhere you go, and I've been to Southeast Asia and Australia and Europe and here, you're all the same. Big heart and loving that one little car. I'd like to thank Russell Ritchie for all his help in getting an old man across the ocean over here. And I'm happy to see all my club brothers, DFL guys, and the Belgian guys, wherever they are, all of you guys, the French guys, you guys are all fantastic and wonderful. You very kindly have had some concern for an old man who, like the Yardbird song, I took a Volkswagen and went up, over, under, sideways, down. And at the time I jumped out of the car, I probably had a couple shots of adrenaline, and I said, I'm good. You need anything? I want an ice cold beer. I needed more than an ice cold beer. I ended up when I have to go too deep, a couple holes drilled in my skull to drain blood out. I was concussed pretty badly, but I'm as good, if not bad, as I ever was. I'm extremely happy to be here with you guys. A lot of people ask me, are you going to go racing again? Yes and no. Yes, I'm going to race Sunny a little bit in brackets. There may be a little underdog future in my life. We'll talk about that later. But in terms of pro racing, my career is done. I was lucky enough to be one of 3 guys to run in the 9-second bracket at 135 miles an hour. Normally aspirated, that means carbureted. No nitro, no turbocharger, that's all BS. We Volkswagen guys like our motors to suck air. I don't discount the turbo guys and the amazing power they make, but this time I'm here, this meeting is not for us, it's not about me and my history, it's about Dave Andrews and the great restorations done in part by Dino and Russell, who makes replicas look like the real thing. So, if we get into it, anybody want to talk Cal look, you know, the lifeblood of my Volkswagen scene? I'm happy to answer any of your questions, but I think this is the Dino Dave Andrews show. So, I'll thank you for allowing me to spit out some English. It's not proper English, as my dad says, we speak American, but I'll try to do the best I can so you can understand me. Anyway, I'm going to give you back to my dear old dad, who I love very much, who is a member of, in my opinion, the #1 Volkswagen club in the world. I'm not discounting anybody else, but here you go, Dad.
Hey guys, don't encourage him. But look, I briefly touched on the legendary BRM wheel earlier on. What is interesting is the fact that at the time, when it was launched in 1968.
The BRM?
Yeah.
66.
66, sorry, about 66.
This is
It
historical
was-
reference.
Yeah, it was just it was the right product at exactly the wrong time.
Yeah.
Because it was launched just as Volkswagen decided to make the move in Europe to begin with across the 4 lug wheels. And that instantly meant that, hey, there are some people that like them. So it instantly meant that the potential market was reduced by 50% or more. The wheels were not a great success. They only lasted on the market for, well, I can't say exactly how long, but until stocks ran out, which wasn't very long at all. It was certainly less than 5 years. We don't know how many were actually made. This will come across. A lot of people, I will lay to rest one rumour which has often gone around, that there is people that have claimed that our family used to own the castings for these wheels and blah blah blah. Well, in 1977, when I first started out in journalism for Hot Car magazine, I actually phoned up Rubery Owen, which was the English metal casting company. It's a huge conglomerate up in Birmingham, and asked to speak to somebody that knew anything about BRM wheels, and the young lady on the end of the phone just thought, what the hell? And I said, these wheels were cast by your company back in the late 60s. Oh, okay. And she said, let me have a think. And then she put me through to somebody who didn't know anything about them. And he said, when was this? And I said, well, we're talking about 66, 67. Oh, okay. Well, there's one guy I know here who used to work here then. And he's still here. And so he put me through to the longest standing employee of Rio. And his words were, I said, do the molds still exist? And he said, no. I said, because the moment we stopped any casting, they do a production run, and at the end of that, said the metal that we used to make the casts was such specialist material, said that they were always melted down and reused. Said, so within months of the wheel production coming to an end, he said those casts would have just been, the molds would have just been melted down, said they would be long gone. So they would have disappeared probably at the latest 1970s, something 72 maybe, but they had gone. So anybody that says they've got the original molds, sorry, definitely don't. Anyway, I'll hand you back to Dad, and he can fill us in on some BRM history.
Thanks, Dad. So, I was working for Gene Berg Enterprises in, I believe, 1968, and Emil Weldon, may or may not know that name, he was at the time a salesman for EMPI, and he would show up at Gene Berg's in a GTV with every accessory possible on the car, and then he'd have big catalogs, and he'd have some sample parts, and he was showing off the brand new wheel. Wasn't really brand new, but in Emil's terms, it was. He had one. It's a BRM wheel. So we talked about it, and he said this is one of the first production run of 250 wheels. Now that's what he said, and Dean and I this weekend said about adding up, because we know people that have too many of them. We actually know one individual who has too many of them. I know you think there can never be too much of a good thing, but we were adding that, and we were adding up Panzers back in the early days who had them, because we went to EMPI and saw the wheel, And a lot of people thought it was awkward looking and quite crazy, but Panzers, who are drag racers, you pick one up and we went, oh, we have to have this. It's like a lightweight iron cross, you know? It's like this great symbol. So anyway, we were counting up numbers, and I'm gonna pass off to Dino. I wanna eventually work back to Mr. Andrews here, because this guy has an unmeasurable, wonderful record in drag racing that I could only wish to duplicate in a modified compact. So we want to get around to that. But right now on the VRM scene, I'm passing it off to my uncle, Dean.
I should mention that I worked for Ron 50 years ago at Fleming and Andrews.
But I'm only 49, so.
We go way back. One thing that I learned about EMPI is Joe Vittone saw it going in two different directions. You know, all of us remember the catalogs, and we mail ordered a lot of stuff, and there wasn't that many speed shops that carried, or dealers that carried EMPI parts. Gene Berg would have been one of them. But in Joe's mind, that was just a small portion, even though they had multi-million-dollar sales to the catalog. He saw a much bigger picture, and his picture was that EMPI would be the source of accessories for the Volkswagen dealers. And one of the things that Joe learned early on is that the profit margin on a stock bug with coming right from the factory wasn't much. So by putting any kind of accessories on, increased the profit margin. And so in his mind, now we're talking 60s, mid-60s, putting wheels on the car and the exhaust system and the C stripes and all that really increased the profit margin, and that's where he saw EMPI's future. And so getting back to the wheel story, wheels were probably the number one thing they put on cars on the car lot. And so he saw, if he was convinced that if I can get all these VW dealers in the United States buying these wheels from me and putting them on their cars, you know, we're gonna have some tremendous sales. So looking to the future, as he often did, he put in these massive orders into wheel companies like Lemertz, 4, 5 lug wheels. And so all these were being made and on their way over when August of 1967 comes along, and like Keith mentioned, the introduction of the Bug and the Deluxe Bug with 4-bolt wheels. Well, that was devastating to him because he had all these BRMs and Sprint Stars and Raider wheels and all these wide 5-bolt pattern wheels, and he thought, I'm going to get stuck with these things. And I think that was the beginning of the end. And the other thing that he found out that Volkswagen really started going after him about putting non-Volkswagen approved accessories on these cars. And they would often go to the dealerships, his dealer, and see these cars with all of these parts on them. And they said, if you don't take these cars off the lot, we're gonna yank your franchise. And they threatened him more than a few times. So that was a bad thing. And there was a story on him that I heard from one of the salesmen that Chick Artisan, which was a big dealer in, was it Newport Beach? Newport Beach. Steve Lewis was one of their salesmen driving a GTV car, went over there and said, you know, if we really need to equip one of your cars on the showroom with wheels and C stripes and all this stuff, so he convinced the chick that we'll do 2 cars. So they spent all day mounting wheels and tires and they put them on the showroom. Within hours, they got a phone call from Volkswagen and said, we just understand that you have new cars on your dealership with your accessories on them. If you do not take those cars off of your showroom tonight, we will yank your franchise. So that really set the pace that he knew that EMPI as a Volkswagen accessory supplier was really going to be a problem. And I think ultimately, leading into the sale of EMPI in '71, that really was the determining factor that he wasn't happy with mail order to you and I. He wanted a much bigger picture, and that wasn't going to happen.
There was no Amazon.
I have a little sidebar about that whole 1967, 1968 thing. My dear friend Rich Kimball and 4 of his friends in 1967, they were in the Newport Beach Volkswagen Club, and they went to Chick Iverson, and they were gonna buy 67 bucks. They're gonna buy brand new bucks. The 67 was cool, 12 volts, all those changes that we know about. And the salesman, I don't know which salesman, said, no, wait. Just a couple of weeks, the new 68s are coming. Oh, okay. So they came back in a couple of weeks and they were unloading the 68s, high back seats, those weird bumpers, 4-bolt wheels, and they were like, ah! And they said, have you got any 67s left? I think we have 5. What colors? We don't care. We want them. They bought all 5 67s. You know, it's an acquired taste. A later bug, past 67, it's an acquired taste. But anyway, just a little side story. I'd like to have Dave Andrews tell you about a fabulous year when he had the B-modified compact record for the whole year, won numerous events, but I'll let him tell you about it.
The trip, right? We were going back east to do some of the circuits, and I think we were probably going to Ohio. And I was driving the Fargo wagon, which was a 1960 panel with no windows.
Volkswagen.
Volkswagen, yes, Volkswagen, which I had bought for $140. And I found it in a field, had chickens living in it. And yeah, I'll take it. So there was a lot of work after that. Built a big engine for it, dual carbs, everything like that, because I was going to pull a car on the trailer. So, started our trip back east. There was 3 or 4 of us. It was John Preston, it was Darrell, me, there could have been one more. But anyway, we're driving along. It's time to get off the expressway, the freeway, and get some fuel. And I pull into the gas station and open the flap and start putting in the fuel. And I looked down at my feet, and there was a pool of oil forming around the tire. As if you probably all know reduction gears. So the bearings in the reduction gears on the passenger side went out. And we're saying, what are we going to do now? Well, we're in the middle of kind of nowhere. Kansas is very flat. I think they had very few dealerships, but we found one. We had our rigs towed there, and when we got to the dealership, they were so amazed to see this convoy of racing Volkswagens that they gave us full reign in the shop, and I mean everything. They took our cars, were looking at them, put them on display. We got to go in, do all the work ourselves with their tools, and change the reduction gear bearings. And it was an unbelievable story. I mean,
The Volkswagen people.
oh, but nowadays you can't even look into a showroom. They don't give you any windows to look into the repair facility, let alone do any work there. So, yeah, that was a good time.
Yeah, tell them you won the March meet and the Winter National.
74 March.
And held the record.
Darrell.
Oh, March meets.
Famous Bakersfield
74.
March meet.
That's on the poster downstairs. And we flat toed that, didn't we?
Yeah, you tell them.
I flat toed. I'm getting a cue there from Dave. We flat toed. I was driving the Fargo. Now this is ugly. This van looks like it has patina, but it doesn't. And it was all painted. When I was in the Air Force, we found a case of zinc chromate paint that is kind of lime green. And my roommate at the time took the zinc chromate and he just sprayed the entire van with the zinc chromate all the way around. And then we accented the highlights and the curves with black paint. So this thing looked pretty radical. And I flat joined the Volkswagen with the tow bar at that time. And I do have a picture of the highway patrol right behind me coming in. When I pulled in, they were right behind me. I don't remember if I ever got pulled over, but that was quite a story. And that was at the March meet. And,
Bakersfield.
in Bakersfield, which from our area is another 100 miles or so. And so we're in modified eliminator. Darrell's in A modified compact. I'm in B modified compact. And we work our ways through the modified eliminator class, which includes gassers and a bunch of other fast cars. We were always the one that got to lead first on the handicap. And they had to chase us, always. Well, it ends up come the final run, which would have been four or five brackets. Me and Darrell end up in the final. So that's that picture downstairs that we did the final in. And we kind of decided.
He won.
And I won, yeah. It would have been 10-5. Yeah, it was kind of, you know, we're out of the same shop, we're good friends and stuff, so. Let's see, I left first or he left first? I'd say I left first.
Yeah.
I left first because my car was a little slower and he was a modified compact, he was a little faster. But before we did our run, we looked at I had stickers all over, as you can see in the poster downstairs. And if you look at Darrell's car, very minimal because the car had just gotten kind of put together. So we added it up, 100, 150.
More money.
200, 2.5, 50. So I had the most to win. So we did it that way, and then we cut it in half. We split it in the end. So
And you held the record that whole year,
I held the record, yes.
and you won the Winter National.
And the Winter Nationals was in Pomona next February after that. And that's what really got the records shaken down. Because we're two Volkswagens. Volkswagens don't drag race. But we beat factory cars. Chrysler, Dodge, Mopar. And Butch Leal, Dick Landy. These guys had big money behind them, and they were the factory. And after I won the Winter Nationals, the rules changed again. So they didn't want that to happen. And I'm sure they got heat, NHRA, National Hot Rod Association, got heat from a Volkswagen winning a predominantly muscle car type race. So, but it was fun. Yeah.
So what kind of time did you run?
Yeah, my car, being a B modified, was a little heavier. Now, these cars are all based on weight,
Pounds per cubic inch.
pounds per cubic inch. So you determine how much your car weighed, then that way you determine how big your motor could be. And they had to be balanced. I think it was, they had to be very heavy in the front. They didn't want rear wheel bias, which our cars already had. So that's why everything got switched up to the front to make it lighter.
Yeah, like the heavier wheels in the front, the lighter wheels.
Heavier wheels in the front, battery in the front, all this stuff to get the weight up toward the front because they were weighed and they had to be a certain percentage. And what was that story the bear had when it went to the skill? Yeah, tell me that story. That was, I didn't even know that.
So like a modified compact was 13 pounds per cubic inch. So on Darrell's car, you have a 127 cubic inch engine. So that car without the driver had to be around 1650. That gives you an idea, whereas a gasser was what, 11 or 1,200 pounds, and these things were full weight cars. Well, not only did you have a minimum weight, you had a 45% of the weight on the front of the car, 55% weight on the rear of the car. So not only did they have a minimum weight, they would weigh the front 2 tires and the rear 2 tires. And so, like Dave said, it was really tricky because you put the battery up front and Nerf bars up front, and that's why his car had the Dia disc brake front end with the 8 spokes, because he wanted the weight up front. And if you notice, his car now has EMPI fiberglass rear wings and a deck that there again, we're trying to take the weight off the back to get this ratio right. So one of the stories that Bear told me is that it was so difficult to get that weight bias right. So one of the times he was weighing the car, they put it on the scales and it was too light in the front end by just a few percentages. So they opened the doors. This is great. This is Racer 101. So they opened the doors and they had taken the door checks out so they could open the doors wide open. By doing that, it moved weight to the front of the car. So when we built Darrell's car, Ron brought the scales over to Chalet's house and we weighed the car. And believe it, I followed Darrell exactly what he did, and that car was right on the money. It was 1,635 pounds. And then we checked the weight bias, we were dead on. So I had, let's try this. So we opened the doors, and then being 1% of the car's weight, so 1,600 pound car was 16 pounds. By opening the door, it took 16 pounds off the back of the car and moved it forward. And so that's how critical it was. And then Bear also told me, he said if it was a windy day, they would put the car either forward or backwards. So the wind is blowing on the door panels and it's pushing the car just a little bit. That's how critical these cars were. Now, nowadays, a car is weighed with the driver, but back then, the car was weighed without the driver. So if the driver was heavy, it was a real disadvantage because that was added on top of it. So the compact class, by design, Integer really didn't want these. They were offering the class because in the 70s, a lot of 4-cylinder small cars were becoming popular, but they knew the Volkswagens could win these races like Chalet and Preston, and they hated these H-gassers. So they thought, well, we'll offer basically a stock class, but we started messing with these ratios to give, like Dave said, to take that advantage away from them. And as time went on, like Dave won the Winter Nationals, they started changing the weight brakes and stuff, and they basically, because they were getting so much pressure from Chrysler when Butch Leo won the Winter National, is if you look at some of Jared's pictures, here's ABC Wild World Sports, all the focus is on Butch Leo, because this is the big name car, 60,000 people in the grandstand, and here's this little blue Volkswagen over here, and he beat him.
He was speaking of Jer Alhannah, which is one of the most famous and our wonderful friend, VW and drag racing photographers in the world, and he's got some great pictures that a lot of you have all seen. And Dee didn't mention, but the rules, they made the rules so crummy. Got to have all the carpeting in, got to have full interior, Take your race car, and don't make it a race car, but do whatever you can to get down the track. And we overcame. And the powers that be in Ford and Mopar and Chevrolet, the big American companies are putting money into this. This can't happen, And among all of us, we're winning races here and there. And rules changes come down the pike. It's amazing what they'll do.
Back to my dad.
Yeah, it's interesting bringing up about how the American domestic manufacturers try to put an end to the dominance of the VWs in the modified compact deal, but exactly the same thing had happened in the earlier days with the gases. whatever. And in the National Dragster magazine, which is the magazine produced each week by the NHRA, there were letters written by V8 racers that actually said, what are we going to do about these Volkswagens, because they're just ruining it for the V8 guys. And obviously, what can people say? I mean, it's their fault for going and buying a V8. If they built a VW, they might have been more competitive. But the everything was being thrown in the way when the Inch Pincher or Dean, whatever, were putting like Denzel heads on the VW motor, with the twin pore, the American, the V8 guys were saying, well, these, this is not legal. They, got to change the cylinder heads and everything. And then, of course, very conveniently, VW came up with a dual port head, and that shut that up straight away. But from the word go, they were doing everything they could to try and bury the VW. And look what happened today. We're still drag racing the things. And VWs are still feared out on the track. I mean, nobody would have believed back then that you have 1,000, 1,200 horsepower VW race motors, turbo cars, normally aspirated cars producing well over 300 horsepower, running the times they do. So in the end, it's the little guy that's ended up coming out on top. So screw them. Because he doesn't actually get to talk very often, I'm just going to hand it back to Dan. I think he needs to have a little chat for a little bit.
I was going to say, I think it's important that everybody knows that back then all the other racers were manufacturer supported, and back for Volkswagen guys did themselves. There was no Volkswagen backing it all. I think that's a big thing that people don't know.
Yeah, most of us that had VW race cars, we didn't have any factory backing, we didn't have any support. We had not a low budget, we had no budget. When we built the Underdog, interesting story, I'll make it real quick. Doug Gordon had a DKP streetcar, and we were all sitting around one summer day and just BSing, talking big stuff. And Doug said, why don't we make a race car? And, okay, well, we're going to do this. He goes, we'll use my car. And he pointed at me and he goes, and you'll drive it. Okay, I'm in. And so we started that day, and we just started taking things off of it. And NHRA always had their eye on the big money sponsors, and it wasn't Volkswagen. So the fact that there were so many races and so many championships, and I'm sitting next to one that were won, it just was embittered them and their sponsorship base. But anyway, if you have any questions about anything, I'm going to pass it on to my uncle here. But feel free to raise your hands and go, hey, old man, I'd like to talk about something.
Detail about the other two cars, the Gear and the 850. So that's part of their shop. The other two cars.
Martin, you're going to have to speak up.
Say the one that again.
You need to talk about the other two cars also, the Fiat and the Gear. The other two races.
Okay, so I'll back up a little bit. I mentioned before that Joe Vittone had brought Dean Lowry in to start a new division of EMPI, and it was EMPI R&D. So that's what he worked on, is tuning all the stuff and developing new products. That went right up to the point of EMPI being sold to Filter Dynamics, which was early on in 1971. And it kind of gave you an inkling of the future, is that Filter Dynamics didn't care about any new product development. They were happy with what was existing. And so the R&D department came to a halt. Well, Darrell still wanted to go racing, and so they created the race shop. And so the financial backing went from EMPI backing R&D to Economotors now backing the race shop. So that would have been right in mid-71. And so that's the change that you'll see on the two cars out in the front, is they don't say EMPI, because these are basically post-EMPI. These are no longer supported by EMPI, although they use a lot of EMPI parts and stuff. these are Economotors. These are, Economotors was not only a Volkswagen dealership, it was a Fiat and Datsun and stuff. And so that was the big change. So the race shop existed from mid-71 until 1975. And then 1975, Dave sold his car, Darrell sold the white car, and he sold the Fiat too. The Fiat went to Puerto Rico. And so by the end of 75, Darrell was done. And he says, we're done with this. I said, I want to start doing something else. So that is the time frame of the race shop. So backing up to your question is that when the inch pincher 2, for kind of a bizarre reason, was part of the sale of an EMPI, which really ticked Darrell off. So when Joe made the deal to sell EMPI to Filter Dynamics, they said, oh, by the way, we want that car. And he said, because that's, that's the image of EMPI. And said, Darrell was ticked. So when the inch pincher 2 went on the road, he said, Darrell wanted to build his own car. So that's where the Fiat came in. So it was a 67 Fiat 850, and Darrell built basically probably the most sophisticated Volkswagen-powered sedan ever made up to that time. And so the engine that was in the Fiat ended up in the white car. And so the Fiat set a number of records, but it's been mentioned before is that there again, the competition didn't like this car. Originally, it had a fiberglass top, which was offered by Gilbert Company. It was an aftermarket company. It was kind of fast back then. So when this car already was way below the index and setting records, people started complaining to NHRA, says, that Fiat over there, that's not the stock top. It has to be a stock top. So we went over to Darrell, and so that's when Darrell started getting really frustrated with the Fiat. So that's when you saw the transition from that nice Cerny painted beautiful top, then all of a sudden it became a roadster with no top at all, and then the people complained about that, and then they put the soft top on, which was more configuration of a Fiat 850. The problem then becomes when you take that top off the car, it became too low. And so then they started complaining about, there's a minimum height, and they said, that car is just too damn low. So Darrell didn't want to completely re-engineer it, so he put bigger tires on the front. Well, that raised the front end up, and they got within the minimum number. Well, then NHRA decided the tires were too big, and if the car did a wheel stand and landed, it would catch the edge of the fender. And so they said, no, the tires are too big, you need to radius the wheel. All of a sudden, Darrell again, he's kidding me. So he hacked out the wheel wells. And so then that quieted him for a while. And so by the end of 73, he says, I need to completely rebuild this car. And that's when he decided to park the Fiat for a year, going through the restoration or changing of it, creating the second phase of that. And that's why he built the white car, kind of an interim car, to race against this guy. And so Dave was in B modified compact then, Darrell was in A. So basically it's the engine size. Dave's motor was maybe a 78 by 88. Darrell's motor, based on cost per cubic inch. And Darrell's motor, which is the motors in there now, was basically the motor out of Fiat, which was an 84, 89, bigger motor, but the car had to weigh more. And so Darrell raced that car from 74 to about mid of 75, and then the Fiat was done, so we sold it to Texas.
Where did the gear come in with all this?
I'm sorry?
Where did the gear feature in this?
John's gear.
The Kia. Are you talking about John Preston? John Preston was, and Dave will probably know more about this than I do, but he was a guy who came from the Midwest, Nebraska, and he kind of hooked up with Darrell and the race shop, and he was a good guy, nice guy, pushed it down, and so he got, I don't want to say sponsorship, but he got help. He got to allow him to work on his car there and do the modifications. But I wanted to say one thing about the really fun about Volkswagen drag racing was we all stuck together. We'd be at the Winter Nationals and we'd all pit together in the same row and we'd help each other because we had a common enemy, and his name was V8 with Ford, Chevy, Dodge, Chrysler, we were gonna beat those VAs because they were, to put it politely, in the company, not very nice to us. And they didn't talk very good about us, but you didn't have much to say when you got your ass kicked by a Volkswagen.
Okay, it's coming up to 3 o'clock. As you know, we'll be back here tomorrow at 1 o'clock. So if you have anybody has any questions right now, fire off. If not, have a think overnight, and I'm sure you'll all be back here again tomorrow, listening to the drunken ramblings of four men. But if there's anything that you want to ask us about, then please go ahead.
Any one of us.
Any one of us. Any one of us.
You mentioned before there was an order of 2,500 VWMs initially made. How many were manufactured in total?
That's still a subject to discuss.
Yeah, I mean that's. If you can actually answer that one, that would be, yeah, amazing. What is interesting is the fact that these wheels are being made in England, you know, by Robrio and for Speedwell. That I can only remember. I mean, I got into VWs over here in 70. Well, I bought my first one in 74. I cannot remember seeing a set of BRMs on a bug on the road over here at that time. They just weren't a popular wheel because we didn't have, you know, the performance industry in the same way. We had, you know, Cartoon and Speedwell and then Auto Cavan, etc., which all, you know, Cartoon, or Speedwell, of course, did a lot of stuff for Minis and Fords and whatever, so the VW thing was kind of, yes, it's a part of the deal, but it's not that important. For Cartoon and Auto Cavan, they basically were importers of, you know, stuff from the States, both MP and DDS. But by the time they were getting off the ground, the BRM was dead. You know, most VWs over here, you know, the new ones are all 4-lug. And so Speedwell, you know, the BRM wheels just didn't feature over here. So all the ones that are over here now, ironically, with possibly one or two exceptions, are British-made wheels sent out to California in 1960, whatever, and then shipped back over here. How many British sold ones survive? We really don't have a clue. Back in 65, Speedwell did have a demonstrator vehicle, which, you know, photographs have appeared quite often, and it was my former wife was a partner with, you know, with her husband who started Auto Cavan, and they bought parts off Speedwell and setting up the company, and the sales manager who would come around and deliver parts to the house they lived in turned up in the demonstrator every day in the 65 1300, the 1350 conversion, BRM wheels, all the Speedwell gauges and steering wheel, and it was just his daily driver, and the car eventually disappeared. We know not where, don't know where any of the parts went, but it is kind of ironic that Speedwell wheels are British. We just never saw them here. And in 76, 77, an advert appeared in, I don't know if any of you remember a weekly publication called Exchange and Mark. It was a little bit like the Orange County Recycler over in the States. That, you know, it was a weekly thing, came out on Thursdays. And it was the go-to place for all classified ads for buying second-hand car or anything. And there was a little advert in 77 from a company that imported parts for American cars. They were based up at Denham in the old film studios, and it just little ad about 3 lines long saying Volkswagen parts from America, MP, etc. All must go. And just a telephone number. I rang up and said, well, what's the deal? I said, well, we used to bring in parts from this company in America called EMPI. Said, and you know, the company doesn't exist anymore, we've got this stock just in here, we just want to liquidate it. So I pumped off work the next day and drove up to the studio. And the girl behind the desk, I said, oh yeah, the parts are in that room through there. And there was a room which was about 10 feet square, and it was literally just piled up with empty parts that were just thrown in there. And at the time I had no money, I just got married, so a few months before. And I was wading through all these parts. There were 2 BRM wheels, brand new ones sat there. If they'd had 4, maybe, but I'm not sure. But at that time, the car I was driving was my old 54 oval TLF25, which I put on a 67 floor pan, so I had 4 like wheels. I looked at BRMs and it's like that. So I bought an eliminator shifter, brand new in the box, distributor brand new, and there are a couple, a few other pieces, and I went, they said, how much are these? And I couldn't afford it all, so I threw like distributor back and this kind of stuff. But a little while later, and I had a little bit more money together, and actually got my first proper job. And I phoned the company up and just said, have you still got those VW parts? And they said, no, after you came last time, I said, we took them down the tip and just threw them all away. So up in West London there is a municipal tip which has got 2 brand new BRMs buried in it somewhere. And they're probably the same story could probably be told across the whole of the USA. Small speed shops, whatever, close the doors, just like, what are we going to do with this stuff? Oh, we'll just throw it away. So it's crazy times. But
Take it away from
well, just aware of the time, but we're going to be back here tomorrow.
Okay.
The posters, we have. I'll do the topless modeling bit, but I'll keep the top on. Okay. You hold that one?
That's easy.
That's easy. That's easy for one hand. You can do lots of things with one hand. There you go. These posters. Well, you should know.
No, let me have that thing.
Yeah, here you go.
We don't have to just talk English history, although I appreciate it. It's great. You want to talk about string racing in Southern California? We're happy to do that. You want to talk about the Panzers, the DFLers, the Belgian Club, sorry, I don't know the initials, all this wonderful international community that we're a part of. We love you all very much. We're back tomorrow. Just a little side note, Keith and I will drink any beer bought for us. We have no distinction, Belgian ales, English ales, it's all good. Anybody want to say anything? Want to say anything? God bless you, Volkswagen freaks. We'll see you tomorrow.